too many conferences where we feel like time would have been better spent not having come to the conference. So at least my objective, in a very small way, is to encourage fresh thinking, dialogue, to be inspired by the opening words that talked about the kind of critical discussion and dialogue, the hallmarks of the Aspen Institute, and I'm very delighted to say of our hosts here as well, here in Abu Dhabi. So with that spirit in mind, I wanted to put forward a couple of thoughts about innovation and introduce an extraordinary panel that we are having for our first session on leadership for an innovation economy. The thoughts I wanted to put forward in brief, the challenge I think today is that the world is at an inflection point. In many ways, there are tremendous challenges. We've had some allusion to the challenges in energy, climate change, thinking about the future of the energy economy. Similarly, if you look in the health sphere, we have an older, fatter, sicker world population, thanks in part to very positive trends. Thanks to vaccination, public health, people are living longer. But at the same time, the tremendous demographic shift that's happening globally poses enormous challenges, including here, of course, at home. These are some of the perils of prosperity that the rising BRICS economies bring. Tremendous opportunities, but also tremendous challenges. The good news, though, the flip side, I think, of some of these challenges that we now face in healthcare, in energy, and some of these other industries, is the opportunity to create entirely new industries through innovation. And I think that's really the opportunity set for leaders, what we're here to talk about, leadership, positioning Abu Dhabi in a global context. I think this is the challenge that countries, that companies, and we all of us as individuals must really think about when we reflect on our careers here in this 21st century as a knowledge-based economy increasingly permeates the global space. How do we reinvent our own educations? How do companies think about talent? How do countries think about their comparative advantages? That's really the great challenge, I think. And three insights that, to me, have come forward in my 2 decades at The Economist. When it comes to innovation, there are some new rules. It's much more open. It's much faster. And it's a lot riskier than it used to be. And I know we'll talk a little bit about the role of failure, culture, entrepreneurship in our panels. But I just wanted to put those thoughts out there in the spirit of the immoderate moderator before I turn to my panelists and to pick up on the comments we received. Let me give them a proper introduction before delving into some of our questions. And of course, we have ample time for your questions to come, very much in the Aspen Institute tradition. So please do keep that in mind. We have with us His Excellency Mohammed Omar Abdullah, Undersecretary of the Department of Economic Development. Please welcome. We have with us the Honorable Deborah Wince-Smith, President and CEO of the Council on Competitiveness. His Excellency Saeed Al-Hajeri, Board Member and Executive Director of the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority. And of course, you've already had the pleasure of hearing from His Excellency Waleed Al-Mokarrab Al-Muhairi, Chief Operating Officer of Mubadala. So again, welcome to my panelists. If I may, let me turn to Deborah first. Deborah, can you give us a sense? I know your organization, the Council on Competitiveness, not only thinks about America's competitiveness in the world, but you have forged a global alliance with a number of other countries in thinking about best practices. Can you give us a sense of why an organization that was born to think about American competitiveness has formed these alliances? What does it tell you about perhaps the nature of innovation in the new global economy, that it may not be quite such a zero-sum game?
Thank you, Vijay. I, of course, would like to echo everyone's comments and be delighted and honored to be here. Before I answer that question, I do have to say, as a Bronze Age archaeologist, that a little bit of this is back to the future, because if you think of innovation, I bet we could all define it in a different way around the room. I like to think of innovation as this concept of abundance and growth. And it's really sort of eye to the fifth power. Every one of us in this room is an innovator. And what really creates the value is the intersection of the ideas, the imagination, the insight, the invention, and then the impact in terms of whatever challenge and opportunity there is. So, some years ago at the Council on Competitiveness, we recognized that our only drivers of productivity and growth and our standard of living we're going to be innovation capacity. We couldn't compete on commodities or standardized products, but we really had to put together all the assets in our nation for this higher value economic activity and to have all the people who drive it. So of course now, we're in this great period, really of tremendous transition, turbulence, and transformation. And all over the world, there is a growing recognition that innovation is really the only sustainable path to individual prosperity, to national prosperity, regional prosperity, and then, of course, global stability. So the U.S. Council on Competitiveness, we've always been proud of the fact that kind of as the first organization to really define competitiveness and now work on the innovation space for some years, we see all over the world the emergence of very creative economies and people that are recognizing this, they're investing in their people. And of course, the other issue is, quite frankly, you mentioned the demographic changes, that by 2020, 80% of all the world's middle-class consumers and growth will be outside of the developed world. So these countries that we're working with, they are our partners, they're our competitors, they're our collaborators, and very importantly, we're creating the future together with them. So this is very much at the heart of our competitiveness agenda in the United States. And of course, the United Arab Emirates is very much one of our close partners, and I hope to talk about that in a little bit.
Great. So in a sense, it's what I hear is a vision of competition and a policy of innovation that doesn't see the world as one versus the other, but rather as a growing pie or a rising tide that might be able to lift many boats. But even so, I think if you have holes in your vessel, the rising tide may not lift your boat quite as much as the other vessels. So I think we'd acknowledge one has to get the local policy right, of course, right? And perhaps on that note, if I could turn to you, Mohammed, I know that there's been a lot of work done on thinking out to 2030 with the new National Innovation Plan. I wondered if you could pick up on one aspect of the pillars, and that is the human capital aspect. How do you think about what needs to build on the success of the past in terms of thinking about education, thinking about the role of possibly talent, migration? And this is a question that I know that cuts right to the heart of the human capital question, also to culture. Many economies have struggled with this, have made different trade-offs. Malaysia comes to mind as an example where they made certain choices about developing national ethnic capacities and different choices about migration. Can you tell us where you come out on this and what you would push forward?
Yes, thank you very much. Let me go back to the innovation as a concept. Innovation is about people, capital, and research. But the purpose of this linkage between these important elements is to create economic value. There is no other purpose than to create economic value out of them. Now, the people is the most important pillar we want to focus on. But people in what sense? It is about their knowledge and skills that they generate through experience or education. That's why education is a very important aspect in this formula, for which when we develop the Economic Vision 2030, we take it into consideration as a serious aspect, and we work with the Education Council to ensure that there is alignment between our Economic Vision 2030 with the education system to create the necessary talent that's needed by the drivers of this economy, and to ensure that we have the right skills and knowledge also from the beginning, so there will be some sort of integration between the economic or the market, the labor needs and the market needs. So by having this, actually, we will be able to build our innovation on the proper based on the proper human capital strategy. Because we have a real challenge here to enable us to realize our Vision 2030. The talent be at the local level or international level is not enough yet to provide the economic value we need for the 2030 vision. So we look at it as a very important challenge, and that's why I think the Vision 2030 with the education system are working now together to ensure we are in the right direction. Now, as for the foreign workers, of course, to attract and retain the foreign workers is also a very important need for us, because the other entities we have to work with other entities to ensure that our policies and regulations are supporting these needs. And of course, now with by having the Vision 2030, we are working hand by hand with the different institutions to ensure that we have on the ground the proper regulations and policy that will enable us to attract and retain talent workers in UAE in general and Abu Dhabi in particular. So what I'm trying to say here, the education system plays a very important role as far as we need, and the focus sector played an important role also to define their needs from talent, and also the other institution, the Ministry of Labor, Immigration Department, play a very important role also to attract and to enable this sector to retain the talent required for the development of our economy.
Thank you. Well, let's pick up on that a bit, Saeed. I know you have some thoughts on this topic as well. How to attract, nurture, and perhaps encourage the kind of talent pool that's required for the ambitions that Abu Dhabi has going forward. What needs to happen, in your view? What are the 2 or 3 challenges? We've talked about the opportunity. What are some of the challenges?
Well, I don't have the answer. Let's start with that. So it is one of the biggest challenges for the government and for the leaders in UAE in general, and specifically in Abu Dhabi. I think the vision is well articulated by my colleagues today. The vision is focused on the industries where we think we have a competitive advantage. That's well articulated, and I think that's clearly said. My issue with implementing that vision is really the talent side or the people side of the story. Also, I have to say that it's well recognized that's an issue, and if you hear the opening speeches, everyone touched on the talent and human side of the issue and how to deal with that issue. It remains, when you look at the data, when you represent, as a local community, we represent 20% of the total population. And the latest numbers I've seen, regardless, we can debate that, but out of the workforce, we represent 5.5%. And going forward, if you assume that you're targeting economical development and focus on big investment and capital investment into focus area where you think you can create value, with that also comes, with a good story comes also the difficulties of, your GDP will grow, and eventually with that, you will also have a population issue mix. Even if I assume focus on capital intensive industry, the population growth, or let's say not the organic one, the unorganic growth of population will erode that mix. So what do you do as a government? What do you do as a mix of society when if you put the numbers together that the workforce, regardless, I think our friends on the education level and our friends on the nationalization level are doing a great job, but I think that the big challenge is really, the story is very big, and Abu Dhabi is doing really big things in terms of introducing new industries. Clearly, we want to attract talent. Clearly, we want to retain talent. But the numbers easily can show you that the workforce in 20 years from now, if you look at 2030, I would challenge that if we can sustain closer to 3% or 2% of the workforce doing what we want to do, even with the focus on capital intensive. So how do you deal with that mix of population and that mix of culture in one society. That's the challenge. I think the challenge is easily can be resolved if really the government, with what I call a state-run economy, that recognize that a state-run economy is a big challenge for innovation. But the handover from a state-run economy that we are in at the moment to a private-run economy should not happen in one day. Should take time. And I think it's well recognized in the vision of Abu Dhabi that we need to move across to that shift at the same time as the government takes its hand off of the economy and introduce the private sector. That handoff challenge requires us to really create, I think we've heard people talking about the hard infrastructure, to really create the soft infrastructure around the story of Abu Dhabi. The soft infrastructure that really, how do you attract talent, and talent that doesn't have a specific nationality? How do you retain that talent? And then how do you make sure that talent breathe and live the story of UAE? These are challenges. My answer is full of challenges, but I think if you really accept that talent doesn't have nationality, that talent can lead the debate and can really reinvent the economy away from the state, you have a vision that innovation can be created by that type of creative talent. You also have to accept debate. If you want innovation, you cannot tell people what to do. In a state economy, you are telling people what to do. I know that the leaders here, and as you can see here, they recognize that, and they recognize that they're willing to let people have debate, willing to hear. And I think leaders, especially in an economy like Abu Dhabi, should really talk less and listen more. Unfortunately, that's not what we're doing today, but in general, that's what we should aim for.
Well, that's a powerful point, and so I encourage all of you in this room to listen, but also speak and ask some questions of our panelists in just a little bit. But picking up on this point, that's really, of course, a cultural point. This is not a unique challenge. For example, Singapore has been trying for quite some time to evolve into an innovative economy. Its leadership has put a lot of resources into encouraging the population to be creative. Let me ask Deborah, since you look across economies, thinking about this, and perhaps I might come to Waleed next. How successful have other places that have tried this model of encouraging from the top down to tell people to be spontaneous, to be more creative? How does that work? I'm being a bit cheeky here, but there's a serious question behind it. How does one encourage a culture that is bottom up and willing to take Saeed's words to encourage that kind of debate? Any successes you can point to?
Absolutely, but obviously this is a bedrock issue for cultures. And I can just share, stories in my own experience, in school all the way up through graduate work. When I studied in Cambridge, Americans were often seen as being a little too aggressive in answering the questions and being willing to push the envelope. But, that's something in our culture that we have from the time, we're little children. And it's interesting how with all the new generations of people from all over the world who are coming, that gets embedded in the system. So I'll tell you a place where I think it's very dynamic and where it's happening at a fast pace, and that's Brazil. Brazil, of course, is, a huge growing economy, the population, second largest agricultural producer and exporter in the world. They have a messy, dynamic culture. And they really like that, and they're also a culture that fuses the core science, technology assets that we all need to know, living in a technological age, with their wild and crazy culture. They really believe that you have to have, dance and art. And I remember, I'll just share this, back in 2007 when we had at the U.S. Council our first huge U.S.-Brazil Innovation Summit. We were preparing for that, and one of their meetings, they had all these dancers and performers, and they were doing all these things, and I came back and said to our then chairman, Chad Holliday, who was CEO of DuPont, I said, we're having our 20th anniversary, and, can we do something that's a little wilder? You should see what the Brazilians did. And he said, yes, but not too wild. But in any event, that's part of what we're talking about with talent and how people really, and I see John Hagel, your Edge Center, but, there's that word now, I don't know if you all created it, edge walkers, and people who are willing to take risks and rewards, and that's what really has to go on in innovation culture. So that's something I would share. Other places in the world, too, that are, I think this is a place that has a lot of potential along those lines as well. And finally, I'll have to say, again, back to the future, and as a woman, I'm proud to say there's no great culture and civilization that have been innovators where women have not played a very powerful role in the thinking and in the fusion of ideas and making things happen.
Great. Well, let's pick up on the point about risk-taking. Waleed, thank you for your introductory remarks. If you can help us drill down, I think in those comments, you did raise one of the challenges of the risk of white elephants, I think you called it, and being very mindful that picking sectors, when the government picks sectors, is not always a success. We need to de-risk that. I think everyone here would appreciate what the significance of that. But at the same time, de-risking is something that makes me a little nervous, because one thing we know about innovation is that it is, in essence, a risky endeavor. It's a loser's game, it's been called, and the founder of IBM even observed this ages ago. The path to success is to fail twice as often. Can you talk a little bit about failure in this culture, and is it something that is embraced? Is it encouraged? Is it a red badge of courage, as it is in Silicon Valley, for example, where if you haven't failed a few times, VCs won't let you run a company because they think you don't know enough. I'm not going to trust you with my money. Go learn and come back on someone else's dime. So talk a little bit about what this means in your cultural context.
Happy to. Thanks, Vijay. So I think maybe to tie in a couple of different things, let me start outward and then bring it back inward, if I may. So, I think a lot of folks said interesting things about looking outside for, models and ways to develop in the way that we want to develop. And I really want to call out two countries. So first of all, as we were thinking about putting this blueprint together, we scratched our heads and we said, hey, where do you start? Is there a comparator out there? Is there somebody that we can look at in order to kind of do a quick copy-paste? Now, you know where I'm heading with this. Obviously, we ran into a brick wall, and you realize that there is no kind of copy-paste solution for this type of thing. So we had to spend a lot of time thinking about what elements were important from an innovation perspective, taking into account all the different issues that everybody just talked about. The human capital trajectory, how people manage innovation, how it works within the academic context, how the state plays, if at all, in the economic arena, so on and so forth. So maybe 2 or 3 different examples. Number 1, of course, we looked at Singapore. Number 2, I think we looked at Singapore and then said, hey, I think we can do actually a little bit better than Singapore. And then we settled on Korea, and I'm going to spend just a few minutes talking about that and why that's so important. Number 3, we looked at Norway. I see that you have Finland here in the notes. Don't know anything about the Finnish experience, but spent a lot of time, looking at common themes with the Norwegian experience. And then finally, the Irish experience as well, which I think had a tremendous trajectory, but then a little bit of a demise afterwards as well. So maybe starting with Korea, because that's kind of an economy that I'm very passionate about. So where the Koreans were, during the Korean War, right? I mean, it was an agricultural society. I mean, it was near starvation. It was an economy that was not particularly blessed with natural resource wealth or kind of anything else that was out there. Fast forward, and you see, and again, there's been a lot of volatility in the experience, and there have been a lot of ups and downs, but you see through state direction, okay? You see the emergence of, frankly, globally competitive, though presumably they could be, very large conglomerates that are working in high innovation areas. The Koreans virtually monopolized the market, both in low-end, mid-end, and high-end shipbuilding, number 1. Number 2, the semiconductor story is well known. Go look at Samsung, and you see that over time, they have come to dominate the memory space. Not too long ago, you had American companies, you had Japanese companies, you had several Korean companies, and others that played in the memory space. They all went bankrupt, virtually, and now you have just a couple of players, with Samsung being by far the dominant player there. You see the Sony-Samsung kind of transition. And that's a really kind of interesting illustrative one. And so you saw, Sony in many ways during the 80s and the 90s as being the rising conglomerate. People felt that this was a comparator this was a referent from an innovation perspective. This was, the place where, MITI, kind of the arm of the state, plus business working hand in hand could really drive innovation and so on and so forth. And for a while they did. And then out of nowhere came Samsung, right? And companies like LG and so on and so forth. And right now, by any metric, Samsung is dominant over Sony, whether it's in the TV space, whether it's in others. So that has been kind of an interesting view of the world, if you will. I don't think that we can, again, do a copy-paste, but there are some very important lessons that we can learn. And I think one of the most important is this nexus of where does the government play, the state, as some people have kind of referred it, and where does business play? And is there a nexus there? And is there an interplay that actually is positive as opposed to being hindering? And so one of the points that I think we've learned, and one of the points that we're trying to make here in the economy, is that we've learned that direction is oftentimes much more impactful than outright control. Right?
Define your terms. What do you mean by direction? And
so,
importantly, what is the limit? Because always the problem is direction sometimes slips into favored industries, slips into grants, slips into technology, slips into winners.
So to me, direction's about a couple of things. Direction's about incentives. Direction's about a regulatory framework. Direction is, how you use a relatively light touch in a spectrum of how government can intervene in the economy in order to really encourage different things that you want to encourage. So ultimately speaking, whether it's through R&D subsidies and or tax breaks, right? So if you've got a tax system, that's one very kind of important lever. There are many, many other ways for a government to have a relatively light or a slightly more impactful way of guiding. Guiding, I think, works extremely well. We're doing it here. We're spending a lot of time thinking about how we can align incentives to make sure that we create a framework for companies and other institutions to do all the things that you talked about. And one of the things that they're going to do is fail, right? They're not going to win all the time. There's a huge amount of tolerance here in Abu Dhabi for a little bit of that volatility, right? As long as that trajectory is upward moving, as long as we can see process, maybe it's in couple year, maybe it's in 5-year increments, right? It's okay to have some of that volatility. And we've seen it. Mubadala has seen some of that volatility. Some of the subsidiaries that we have also experienced that. Lord knows that as we deploy capital, and our two largest, whether it's aluminum or the semiconductor space, those are both pro-cyclical. That is the definition of having a little bit of volatility in the system. But ultimately speaking, we're taking a position that says, hey, look, we think that the trajectory is mainly going this way, and so therefore, failure in that context is okay. Obviously, it's incumbent upon us to minimize it. It's incumbent on the government to make sure that the incentives, again, don't encourage it, but rather, create an environment where constructive failure can lead to future success.
Let me pick up on that. Saeed, we had spoken a little earlier. You had expressed a view that venture capital needs to play an important role going forward. In sort of taking forward some of the ideas put forward on direction, can you tell me how that can be encouraged, given, again, your starting point as a country that has benefited from enormous petroleum resources. Traditionally, countries that have had lots of resources like that, and Korea being the counterexample, it's a country with very few resources, but a lot of resourcefulness. One could say that about Singapore or Taiwan or Japan as well. It has been difficult to get off the resource curse, well acknowledged in the economic literature, towards an entrepreneurial culture. What's your suggestion or plan for the most important thing or two to do?
Well, again, venture capital as an industry doesn't need capital. If you look at the industry and you look at the data, and the data is widely known, 20% of venture capital are successful, 80% fail. That's the rules. On top of that, the 20%, they're really not a huge capital-intensive industry. And they have so much investors waiting in line to be part of that story. So, people like Adia, people like Norway, people like Singapore, they have an allocation to venture capital waiting to go to the top 20%. So one of the competitive advantage of Abu Dhabi is capital. So that we cannot offer. So we have to cross that out of the list of things that we call competitive advantage. We have to look at other things that can attract venture capital. I think my colleagues already alluded to the talent and the environment, tolerance, how to create an environment that can make Abu Dhabi a home for these type of people. And I think the focus really should be around that softer investment that makes this a place for a lot of people to live and to find home. This will touch into too many sensitive issues, but we need to tackle them now. We cannot push these issues back and not discuss them. I think when I alluded
Let's
to
pick you up on that. Give one example,
well,
just to get the day off on the right note.
If you want someone to move from Silicon Valley, where I think the only successful example of venture capital, with all respect to others and other example, I think the others are copycats of a successful story, real invention, real new story. I have, at least from my personal experience, I only seen Silicon Valley where they've created that. What would convince someone from Silicon Valley to move and to live in Abu Dhabi? And I think it's more lifestyle, it's more family, it's more culture, it's more tolerance, acceptance of others, diversity, all these things. And the challenge is, how does a government like Abu Dhabi or a government like UAE set a model where you can accept this diversity and also have your identity at the same time? I think we need to focus all our effort in such debate and such investment. And really, most of our investment should be around that type of culture creating. I see a lot of initiatives happening. I think the culture, the tolerance side of Abu Dhabi is happening. I think we need to invest more in that. And that, unfortunately, is not a commercial investment. That investment will always have, KPIs are different than the typical KPIs. It's more subjective and usually are a long-term investment. So anyone who would try to cover that will be killed by debates of wasting money, because this is a 10, 15 years investment. So the tolerance and accepting failure should be a major thinking in Abu Dhabi. And we should be able to look at subjective returns when it comes to industry like culture and industry like tolerance.
This is a powerful challenge, and it's also one that is not easy to conquer. If you look at even the wealthy economies of Europe, they have not been successful at nurturing entrepreneurial success in, for example, the software industry, the great industries of the last 20 years that have emerged. I challenge anyone to name 5 giants that have emerged from Europe versus the Microsofts or the Googles or the Facebooks that have emerged, as you say, from the West Coast to the US. And I think part of it has to do with, of course, things like bankruptcy codes and the framework conditions, but culture. And here, maybe I'll ask Mohammed to talk a little bit, since you think about economic development day in and day out. I mean, even in Europe, I think culturally, if you're in France or Germany, if you fail with a startup company, it's not only that in some parts of Europe you can't serve as a director of another company for some time, for 10 years, but your auntie won't invite you to the good dinner parties because she's ashamed of you. They'd rather you worked at Siemens or Electricité de France, have a good, stable job as a professional. And so there are long, hidebound traditions of culture in many societies, even wealthy societies. And so I wonder, again, in your own cultural context, how do you think about moving towards a little bit more of this risk-taking culture when we have the traditions here that you have to start with where you're starting from, of course?
As you know, the economic development take the cultural issues in the heart of the plan, actually, because it is about the people, heritage, and identity. So to maintain this balance, actually, every government look at it carefully to make sure that with the development happening around the country, we maintain this identity. And simply by accepting others, gaining from others the experience and exposure, interact with the others, and yet to maintain your own value and identity. You cannot separate yourself from the world. The world becomes a small village, and we have to interact with the others. That's why in the vision, to state there clearly that we want to be integrated to the global economy and to ensure the benefit for the all, and to ensure to give the opportunities to the all people in Abu Dhabi, being Abu Dhabian or non-Abu Dhabian, being UAE national or non-UAE national. So this is the basic concept. Also, to attract talent, you need to make sure that you provide the right conditions and to enable you to be part of this game. Otherwise, there will be a very difficult situation for you to meet your targets and to meet your goals. So here, when we talk about economy that want to be diversified, and you want to have the non-oil sector to play the greater role within the coming 20 years, definitely you have to take into consideration that the innovation, when it comes to this game, it has to be depend on, to the certain degree, to the talent first, to the foreign talents that you are going to bring to. So it is the equation that we have to maintain. And now you have the education system, which is being, developed, and there's a great emphasis on this education system. You have the infrastructure is being built to ensure that the conditions provided to the innovations are there to help in making the necessary access to the people, to the network, international network, and also to maintain to a certain degree the social innovation. If we talk about the type of innovation we'd like to see is that they are integrated together, being the process innovation, social innovation, product and service innovation, and technology innovation. So both has to work together to make sure we have the right framework that can work for our people and for the private sector. Thank you.
Well, inspirational notes, I think, a note to turn to questions. Let me ask for questions from our audience. Let me, I see that Dr. Sridhar is enthusiastically put his hand up. Just a couple of ground rules, if you don't mind. Please, of course, identify yourself. Please wait for the microphone. We are recording this, and so for those reasons. And if I may say on a personal note, please, no lengthy gas bag interventions. Make it a short and sharp question.
K.R. Sridhar, Bloom Energy. So innovation and talent. Talent can be inherent, it can be educated. Innovation coupled with entrepreneurism is what you're looking for, and that's an attitude. And that attitude comes from the environment and the culture. You mentioned, Saeed, about Silicon Valley people being able to come out here. When you pick a sector, and we heard about picking a sector, no system is wise enough to figure out in a sector who ultimately will be the winner or loser. We couldn't have figured out iPod and iPhone being the leader in its sector. We couldn't have figured out Google being the leader in its sector, even living in Silicon Valley. So when you bring these people in, you're going to bring a portfolio, and because you can't pick winners and losers, and how you treat the losers more than how you treat the winners is what's going to dictate what happens to the next wave of innovators that come in. I'll just stop there.
Let's pick up on that. Do you want to give a quick rejoinder since you were called out, Saeed?
Sure. You kind of answered the question yourself with is innovation a top-down or is it a bottom-up? I think that's the essence of the debate. What we're trying here is, and we know if you approach it from a bottom-up approach, you should accept losses, you should accept failures. And I think when you don't have that choice of starting bottom-up, the only choice you have is starting top-down and choosing intellectually what is the most, or the sectors that you can do. You cannot do everything, so you have to choose where you think, with help and external help, people experience, countries experience, which sector really have the best chance of being successful. So you mentioned a word which I like, it's a portfolio. When you look at portfolio, you need to look at the overall picture. You cannot take one investment out of that portfolio and judge your overall exercise. So the exercise need to be looked at from a portfolio point of view, but also need to be looked at from a clear KPIs that accept volatility, accept extreme volatility, even failures. So you need to build that into your model. And that model should not be the Wall Street model of next quarter. It should be the long-term investment model of 15, 20 years model. So within that, you have a volatility matrix or standard deviation around accepted outcomes. And as long as the portfolio is within that, I think you should accept it. You should have your leader accepting that. So your KPIs are numbers and some soft KPIs, qualitative, quantitative approach that looks at portfolio. So my answer is really built into your question, is really using a portfolio way of doing it. And you have no choice other than top-down.
Did you want to follow up, Deborah, briefly? A quick follow-up.
Yeah, I would sort of disagree with that, because I think that if you look at these grand challenges, particularly the nexus of food, water, and energy, there are so many innovations that are occurring from innovators that are looking at problems in a different way. So I think it is a combination of thinking big and strategically, being willing to have this creative destruction, but also allowing this fervent of creative thinkers to come up and then have the opportunity with an idea to have some way to begin to bring it to fruition.
What's the thing you're disagreeing with?
Well, that it's a top-down, that you have to have a portfolio. I mean, if you ask countries all over the world, they all want to be the leaders in biotechnology. They all want to be the leaders in innovation in IT. Actually, those three, biotech, IT, and nano, they're the platform for everything. So you have to have those core capabilities. It's what you build on top of them and how you think about that to solve these global problems that are really going to be the place where there's a huge innovation surge.
Very good. Let's go to the next question. Again, please kindly identify yourself.
Excuse me. Rick Klausner. I'm with the Column Group. And I wanted to comment on this issue of the difference between building an education, a higher education environment, versus what it's like the top versus bottom down for what KR was referring to about innovation, something I've advised various governments on in that same struggle as around this table. And there is something, I do not think, per se, a terrific higher education system. It is incredibly important in so many ways, I don't have to go through, but it does not guarantee at all, and in many ways, we've seen this in Europe for many years, a higher education system that is incompatible with innovation, taking chances, et cetera. One has to instead, I believe, look, and particularly the space I know well, which is medicine and biotech, the recurrent phenomenon over 50 years of individual institutions, Vienna in the 30s, Cambridge in the 40s, and on, very limited institutions that one can actually study and analyze and recognize that the top-down approach is to try to build and enable institutions that call for what we recognize as innovation. If I had to sum it up, and some people have heard me give these speeches in the United States, which I think is really struggling with this, where we have built a very high-level research environment that's not about innovation. It's about getting projects done, small, successful projects. It's all towards success. We know how to do projects. What we've lost tremendously is telling young people they can work on solving problems. There's a fundamental difference between approaching problem solving. And once you formulate that, you get away from all this worry about structuring multidisciplinarity. It doesn't matter. Multidisciplinarity self-assembles around solving a problem rather than doing a project. I say that because there are a few examples which I would recommend you look at, and Singapore is not one of them. Nokia in Finland is one. The Dresden Max Planck Institute is one. The Broad Institute in Cambridge. there's a handful of institutions that have actually created a place where young people being empowered to think they can solve problems. An amazing phenomenon. That's what I think is the closest thing to creating what KR is talking about. And I actually think it's doable in a top-down way. And I'll just end by saying, when we analyzed that, there was one...
Okay. Just, you've given us something to chew on, a provocation. Let me, happy to welcome a response from my panel. But if not, we happen to have with us the head of a leading university, John Sexton. Perhaps, John, we can ask you for a response from your perspective.
Well, I'm happy to respond. I'm not quite sure I'm agreeing or disagreeing. So let me respond in this way. I think I'm disagreeing because of your topic sentence, which seems to dismiss a commitment to higher education as a key to the puzzle. When, well, then fine. I don't care if I'm agreeing or disagreeing. I'm going to make the point that Daniel Patrick Moynihan made 40 years ago when asked, how do you create a great city? He said, create a great university and wait 200 years. Essentially, I would embrace and accept Saeed's comments. I've said in New York, which was built on fire, finance, insurance, real estate in the 20th century, that fire was a necessary but insufficient condition for greatness in the 21st century. You had to supplement fire with ice, is my phrase, the intellectual, culturally educational. That's what I see Abu Dhabi doing. And my brief comment about the panel so far and in response to this is, which I think is where we agree, is that what I admire and what attracted NYU to Abu Dhabi was a commitment to think creatively about the future and to think in the longer term and not quarter to quarter, which in our world means to think in terms of pure research and unleashing young people. And when you come specifically to the question you've been focusing on so far, Vijay, I will tell you this. I think Abu Dhabi recognizes that talent attraction is core to the enterprise of the future. What you need is smart people. So as Saeed put it, how do you get somebody to move? I deal with that day in and day out when I deal with the question, how do you attract Nobel quality faculty, either from NYU's campus in New York to a commitment to Abu Dhabi, or from wherever they are in the world to a commitment to Abu Dhabi? And the answer is, you can attract them if you present them with the exciting possibility, which is less and less present in higher education institutions around the world, to be part of a creative enterprise. And the jiu-jitsu move is understanding that thought does not recognize sovereign boundaries, and that you cannot own thinkers, and that thinkers today are in a circulatory system, a network. And if you can say, we don't need to own you, we just want your participation. We want you to circulate with us. And frankly, what we've done, and the first evidence, I don't claim it's a proof of proposition, is we've just been able to succeed in attracting a group of young people as strong as any group entering any university or college in the world. They turned down the leading universities in this world to come to what, our campus isn't even built yet. Why did they come? They came because of each other. They came from around the world because they could participate in the first genuinely cosmopolitan student body in the world and get a great education with thinkers. It's all about critical mass, and they've just been unleashed to become the leaders of global civil society. And it's Abu Dhabi's willingness to say, what we care about is not owning that. Of the 150 kids that just came, if 10 of them stay, we're ahead of the game, but 140 will leave knowing that Abu Dhabi's the center of the world, or at least a center of the world. And we don't have to have sovereign authority over them. And frankly, we couldn't have attracted them if we had claimed them only for Abu Dhabi. We attracted them by saying, you come here and you can do, 6 of your 8 undergraduate semesters here and do the other 2 in Shanghai or Prague or Buenos Aires or New York or London. They were attracted by that cosmopolitan circulatory system. So talent becomes the key, and unleashing the talent in critical mass is the key. I don't think you do that in any city without a great university. So it is a sine qua non. And I think that's probably where we agree. So the question is, where are the instances? And I hope NYU Abu Dhabi is one of them.
You put forward, in addition to a robust defense of the university as an institution, exactly. You have also put forward, I think, a couple of very powerful ideas that are relevant to our panel and indeed our couple of days together. That is, in a world of open networked innovation, we understand the power of networks. You don't have to be on Facebook to appreciate this, but long before that, networks were important, but it's a multiplier effect. The idea of capturing and owning talent and keeping it sequestered in some kind of secret R&D lab and locking in ideas with patents. I think the world is rapidly evolving beyond that. Certainly the innovation ecosystem's evolving very rapidly beyond that. And I think John Hagel here from Deloitte Center for the Edge, you've co-authored a wonderful book that touches on some of these topics. Could you give us just a brief insight, particularly thinking about the edge and the center and the tension between the world being flat in a certain sense, a la Friedman with ideas and goods and services moving, and spiky, as Richard Florida has argued, that is the world of urban clusters, institutions, and where ideas are generated. We're actually coming to a sort of a hybrid view on these things, aren't we?
Yes, I'm very intrigued with the discussion and very pleased that there is so much focus on talent as a key theme in terms of economic development and growth. It occurred to me, though, that the discussion on talent was framed in two different segments. One was the challenge of attracting and retaining talent to the United Arab Emirates, and then on the other side, it was the challenge of developing talent through educational institutions. And I think there may be a missing element there, and it was kind of implicit in some of the discussion, but I wanted to pull it out and make it more explicit, which is thinking about the opportunity to develop talent beyond educational institutions. How do you begin to restructure and rethink all your institutions to accelerate talent development throughout the life of an individual, as opposed to just the educational period of their life? And if you were able to become a platform for accelerated talent development across all institutions, I suggest you would probably attract as much talent as you could possibly handle and retain all that talent, because this would be the place to be if you wanted to develop your talent. So I think that that's a potentially rich area to explore, and it has to do obviously with issues of innovation, risk-taking, financial support for risk-taking, all of the elements that were discussed. But I think focusing on how do we accelerate talent development across all institutions, and then related to that and to the notion of networks, the notion of attracting and retaining talent assumes that all the talent has to come here. No matter how successful you are in attracting and retaining talent here, there will always be much more talent outside of the United Arab Emirates than inside. And the question is, how do you connect to that talent most effectively to develop your own talent more rapidly as well? So I think it's a very rich discussion.
Terrific. I know a gentleman has been patiently waiting with a microphone. I'm sure this topic of networks and connectivity of nodes of innovation will be picked up on as we go forward in the next 2 days. Please identify yourself, sir.
Hello, I'm from Etihad Airways. Just came back from America where I had a business development position in North America, and over here now taking over the sales government sector of Abu Dhabi. My question is, excuse me if it diverges away from any of the topics, I hope it doesn't, is there more that the people of the UAE in terms of culture? Well, of course, culture is a very key point when it comes to the United Arab Emirates, and a lot of sectors, including Etihad Airways, is partaking in reaching out to the rest of the world through the various sponsorships and through even our own cabins in terms of the touch of the UAE. Just like Honorable Deborah said that she would never forget the Brazilian event, other than us going around and dancing in our cultural dances in the streets, does any of the people, the honorable people over here, think that there's more that we can do in touching the people with our culture? Therefore, maybe that in itself would retain the talent within our culture, and even if they do leave, they remember us by remembering the good points of our people and our culture.
Great.
Thank you.
Wonderful question. Anyone on the panel want to pick up on that?
I'm going to pick up on one example because really on the Brazilian case, I think it's an interesting model because, you know, what's going on between the U.S. and Brazil is really building these cross-integrated networks around innovation hubs. So for the first time, we're going to be seeing startup companies in the United States that are actually going to Brazil to be incubated and to launch, and vice versa, Brazilian companies. We should think about that as a model for doing something between the two countries. And I hope we're going to do that with the new Emirates Competitiveness Council. But in addition to talking about innovation, we need to do some really concrete things that are actually creating innovation.
Great. Let me come here first. I saw this hand here first. Then the gentleman to my right, and we'll come to the audience next.
Somebody over here want to go? Tfaddal. I just want to share more about Abu Dhabi's experience culturally.
Kindly identify yourself, sir.
My name is Ahmed Al Saeed. I'm the chairman of Aldar Real Estate Company. Abu Dhabi has been able to achieve a lot in the last 5 years culturally by doing very little in terms of supporting culture. So we have Senate, for example, supporting filmmaking in the Middle East. Today, the film festival, next week I think, will have at least 5 films from the Middle East, which Senate supported, not by providing millions of dollars, but by giving $20,000, $60,000 grants. That is success. That is bringing talent which does not live here to make an effect here on our people, on our culture. Our culture is not limited to Abu Dhabi. It's wider than this. We have Emirates Foundation was also started 5 years ago. Today, it supports through grants hundreds of scientists, of artists, of both here in the UAE, universities, and outside the UAE. Again, those are people we own by being associated with and by being probably the only Middle Eastern country that has opened its doors for supporting them. Abu Dhabi Award, again, was something we started 5 years ago. And the government and the president and the crown prince, through this award every year, honor 10 people from all sectors who have made a difference in society. And we've seen an incredible amount of the dedication to our society by just creating this annual event that celebrates these individuals. And I can cite more examples of this. But I want to, I think, conclude by saying we are attracting talent in Abu Dhabi despite all the challenges, despite all the obvious problems which exist in a society like our society, because we are open and because we are actually used to living with different people and different cultures. Who do we retain here? Do we want to retain everybody in the long term? That's a question which we will answer, but it's also a question that people who want to live here must answer. I know a lot of expatriates who come here with a conviction they want to stay 2 to 3 years here and help our society, and that's fine. But I know others who want to live here forever, and that's something we need to define and work on with. To just end my intervention here, I want to support the university's argument that President Sexton brought forward. Sheikh Zayed ambition was amazing. In 66, when he became ruler, we had, I think, 2 schools. And by 73, he ordered a university to open, a full-blown university to open. So without even high school graduates being available to him. And by 76, that school and that university started producing people. Today, all our cabinet ministers, most of them have graduated from that university. Most of the women, my sister included, who would have never been able to go to university abroad, went to that university. So our vision that Sheikh Zayed created, I think, supports many of the discussions that went around this table. But I am very close to the university argument. I think it will make these 5 universities which we are building now in Abu Dhabi will make a huge difference. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I saw the gentleman there was gracious to concede the microphone.
Yes.
You have it back.
Tara
And then we will go
Abdel-Megid.
to the gentleman waiting in the audience. Yes.
Thank you. Tara Abdel-Megid from Perella Weinberg Partners. This question is for Waleed and Ambassador Al-Taiba. I think Waleed made the very clear point that the UAE's productive capacity will, by definition, always exceed its consumptive capacity, which suggests that whatever it is that we're talking about ultimately has to have, in effect, an exportable or global dimension to it. And my question is, Abu Dhabi and the UAE in general have the luxury of being in a position where we can even be having this debate, but it's not an island, and it lives in a neighborhood. And my question is, how do you think about, not the geopolitics, because that's not what this is about, but what about the geoeconomics, so to speak, of the plan for the UAE and the 2030 plan? What are the dimensions of how Abu Dhabi deals with the economics and the economic environment of the broader region?
Okay, sure. Thanks, Terry. I think, good question. Oh, sure. No, I thought
Actually,
this would
yeah,
come on. Okay.
it'll come
I guess
on.
it's on now. Yeah, I'm hooked up. Okay, so maybe starting from a slightly different starting point. Let's see where we end up. But I think it's a really important question. So we live in an environment, forget the geopolitics, as you said, geoeconomically speaking, where most of the economies, especially the smaller Gulf states, are really trying to articulate and do the same sort of thing. Meaning, look at their comparative advantages, essentially, though in different ways, try and develop export-leading industries that then export. What's interesting about that story is that the great majority of that trade and export doesn't happen in between each other. Right? It doesn't happen among and between. It happens to other centers of the world where you have tremendous absorptive capacity. Small example that we're doing. So you'll see that Bahrain, Abu Dhabi, Dubai, Qatar, potentially Saudi, are all looking in the aluminum space. Right? Some of us already have exporting companies that already exist. Nobody is looking at, potentially, we don't see Saudi as a massive market. We don't see any of the other economies around here as large markets. As we developed Emirates Aluminum, which is our flagship project here, we're looking at China and we're looking at Europe, right? Huge amount of absorptive capacity. Any kind of potential spillover that I think that can help, link all these economies are happening. But the truth of the matter is that there isn't a lot of thought and there isn't a lot of work that's happening to kind of make all these linkages happen. Now, there probably are a lot of reasons for that. And I think a lot of it has to do with, again, absorptive capacity, right? Qatar and Abu Dhabi are going to export aluminum to each other. Doesn't make a lot of sense, right? And so as long as we keep kind of having parallel strategies this way, then I think you're going to see way more individual linkages between these individual countries and large blocks, Europe, Asia, wherever else it might be, and less connectivity kind of among and between. And that's really what the state of affairs looks like today. I think as we develop, that could change, because part of the development story that we're articulating is also increasing our absorptive capacity internally. And so if that works, I think naturally you're going to see some of that as well.
When we look at our economy and we look at the various things that we are able to export, whether in goods or services, in being ambitious as we are in the UAE, we don't look at just the region. We look at countries where our goods and services would have the largest amount of bang for your buck, so to speak. So the countries we tend to look at are China, India, United States, Europe, and one of the biggest markets for us that we are trying to really enter that we think is untapped right now is Latin America. So whether it's aluminum, whether it's services of some sort in terms of Dubai Ports World is a good example because they are operating about ports in I think 22 different countries right now, and that's a service. We tend to look well beyond our region. If we looked at our region, I don't think we would be doing ourselves a favor. We are far more ambitious than that. I think what we're going through right now is probably what Waleed would call a cyclical piece of the global recession that we are undertaking. So perhaps it is not at peaking as most countries are, but I think if you look at everything we're doing as a whole, and I wrote a few of them down, nuclear energy, renewable energy, education through organizations like NYU, MIT, Guggenheim, Louvre, semiconductors, aerospace, tourism, Formula One. That all, if you look at the collective value of all of this, it means that we are ambitious. This, like KR said, that alone is an attitude, and it means we're trying to be on a global stage. So I would take the regional economic piece out of it and put the UAE on more of a global stage.
Clearly, the ambition is breathtaking, and so the implementation, I think, will be the challenge. But I think everyone will agree. Hats off for thinking globally in an ever more global economy. Let's turn to a lady who's been waiting here, and we'll come next to the gentleman who's been very patient. I believe you have the microphone. Please identify yourself.
Hello, my name is Safiya Al-Makhtari. I'm from Mubadala Healthcare.
Do we have the microphone on?
My name is Safiya Al-Makhtari. I'm from Mubadala Healthcare. First, I'd like to thank you for your thoughts. I'd like to touch on the education and human capital pillars of innovation, just like most of you have touched on it. From my own perspective, I think of innovation, human capital innovation, as a pie. So how much of that pie should be local instead of it being imported? I don't have any problem with importing human capital, but I also believe that a certain percentage of that innovative population should be local, understanding the local mentality. So why is that a challenge? We're 20%, as His Excellency mentioned. 5% of that population is working force, and assuming 50% of that 5% is innovative is very ambitious. So you also mentioned the Korean economy and how they were not blessed for having the hydrocarbon wealth. So my question is it a bless or a curse in terms of human capital development? The Korean had the war, and they had to, in order to survive, they had to be innovative and be creative to create their wealth. In our society, rather, we exported the wealth from the hydrocarbon revenues. So how do you embed innovation in a society, in a wealthy society that not necessarily sees the need for being innovative? We're fortunate the government and the leadership sees the need for innovation, but how do you embed it in a society, in children, to become the norm for the future?
Thank you. Actually, two related questions in a sense, aren't they? They both come back to developing the human capacity and unleashing the innovation potential of the local population, given the endowments. I put this, and it's quite a challenging question, to perhaps to Waleed, if you want to take it.
I think I can start. I hope that other people can
yes,
address it
and let's. I mean, Warren Buffett answered this question by not giving his children very much of his money, right? And yet you have a country, in a sense, with enormous patrimony, oil resource, are you ready not to give it to your children?
I think first, I'd like to thank you for asking that question. That question is in many ways at the heart of just the intellectual, I think, debate that we all have among and between ourselves in terms of how we see ourselves developing over time. Right? We've all heard the debates about, the resource curse. We've also heard and we've seen that it can be actually quite good from a transitioning perspective. It reduces the pain. It does a lot of things as we try and deconstruct our economy as it is today and move into other types of productive sectors. I certainly don't have the answer. If I had the answer, then I think we'd know how to get to where we need to get to. But it's an important question that I think needs a lot of thought, a lot of debate. It's one that we're going to have to fundamentally address, and it's one that I think over time is going to shape our journey. And it's really very foundational for us going forward.
Any other thoughts from my panel, specifically on this question of resource endowments? Deborah?
Well, I'll jump in. One of the things we're talking about, of course, is attracting and retaining talent, but I really think in the long term there has to be a strategy of growing your talent, earning your talent, and really thinking that every human being that's here has the potential to contribute to this economy. And so that's, something certainly the Koreans did. They went out, but at the same time, they recognized that they were going to have to build this themselves. On the resource issue, some interesting data points, in the United States now, we have the data that shows that the value of our intangible assets are 3 times that of traditional tangible assets. So again, that's getting into all the creativity, the know-how, intellectual property and open environment. So those are things, that really come from a economy that is not focused really in one particular area, but seeing a lot of the possibilities from the intersections.
And indeed, just on that last point, the OECD is developing new metrics and measurement tools to try to measure these intangibles in a more intelligent way, something that usually doesn't appear very effectively on national accounts or company accounts. But in a knowledge economy, the knowledge worker, as Peter Drucker coined the phrase, often walks out with most of your company's assets at the end of the day when he goes home or she goes home. How do you account for this properly, and so that decisions can be made at the company or national level on policy? Sir, you've been very patient. Please identify yourself and a good question.
My name is Hassan Jarrar. I'm the head of wholesale banking for Standard Chartered Bank here in the UAE. And I think I dare say that the majority of people in the audience probably were thinking to ask the question that you asked. I'm very passionate about both cultures. I'm an Arab American, so I've seen both. And while I respect higher education, my daughter goes to NYU, one of them does, I think we need to keep it a bit simpler than that. Blue jeans and Google and Yahoo could not have been invented had the kids in the US, mainly in the western side of the US, had not had the freedom to think. They need to be given the freedom to think. By contrast, in this part of the world, and this is not an Emirates phenom, it's an Arab phenom. We don't encourage our kids to speak in the presence of adults, for example, because it's inappropriate. You go back to the US, nope, you're encouraged to speak and express your opinion, and if it's inappropriate or rude, then it's dealt with in an appropriate manner. I think we need to loosen up and honestly learn how to deal with this issue, because by the time our kids get to the higher education, it probably would have been too late, because their main objective is to get the degree and come back and work in a prestigious institution in Abu Dhabi or Dubai and so on. I'm very passionate about homegrown talent. I love the fact that the Emirates is importing a lot of qualified people, and this is more so in the last 10 years than in the past. But I question the sustainability of this country continuing to go where it wants to go without growing homegrown talent. Emirati kids need to be taught to live with less. They need to learn where money comes from, and they need to be challenged. I do it in my job, and I have 42% Emiratis working for me of my population. Unless we do that, then the UAE will continue to import transient population, who, as his Honorable Ahmed al-Saeed said, either will come here and live for 2-3 years, or they want to live here forever. So we need to learn, we need to teach kids how to think creatively. We need to teach them not to be afraid of failure. We need to make sure that it's okay for them to make mistakes. Yeah? Otherwise, we'll continue to import things, and that, in my opinion, this is unsustainable. Sorry to be long-winded.
No, thank you. That's actually quite an eloquent contribution. Somebody on the panel wish to add to that or challenge that? Someone?
Well, I think, you know, I've been looking at Mr. Saeed. I think he's itching to respond.
Okay. Please, the microphone is yours.
I am also passionate about talent, local talent. And I just want to say none of this would have been possible without local talent. So you are here in the most advanced city in the Middle East. We're better than Cairo, we're better than Beirut, we're better than all the metropolises, the greatest metropolises of the Middle East, because of the local talent. Not just me, but everybody else sitting around this table. We are the reason today, and when I say we, I mean the Emirates people. We are the reason everybody else is trying to look like us. And it is an amazing ambition. When you look at Sheikh Zayed's startup, most of us would have been dead if it wasn't. I mean, the mortality rate, you guys have to understand where it all started. The mortality rate in 1966 was almost 50%. So half of us would have been dead. So we were not just having a serious problem economically, we were actually shrinking as people. And this is really now stopped. We're growing as people. So that's the first solution you need to understand about the talent. And the second reason we are successful is because we were able, from the beginning, to attract Arab talent first and multinational talent. We love them as our brothers and colleagues, and they live here, and they've lived here for the past 40 years, 50 years, as equal to our own self. That is really the second reason we're different from the rest of, and you will hear stories about this. So it's our answer to this question is very much, we are the reason we are making this progress. To answer Safiya, Sheikh Zayed had an answer to this. This is a famous story about resources. A journalist asked him, you are wasting too much money on your people, Your Highness. There is too much allocation that goes of resources to these people. Are you not spoiling them? And he answered back, and he said, do you have children? And he said, yes, I have children. He said, do you give them food? He said, yes, I give them food. Do you give them clothes? He said, yes, I give them clothes. He said, my people are the same. When he started, they had nothing. And I've grown up with you know, I'm almost 50 now. I've seen my grandfather and my granduncle, and those were grand people in terms of their understanding of the world and of poetry but they really had nothing. They did not have formal education, and they lost all their capital in the 30s with this collapse of, they were merchants, but they lost their capital. They had nothing. So we had nothing. Sheikh Zayed was wise to give us everything. He made us, again, able to be. I went to school in the US. My father didn't even know. I went to the Ministry of Education, got my scholarship, and I went to the US, and 4 years later I was back, and my father was very proud and happy. But really, he didn't know. Sheikh Zayed knew. Sheikh Khalifa, they knew about us. So I think in terms of resources, we are not spoiling our people. We had nothing. We had no education, we had no money, we had no capital, and somebody had to give it to us. Somebody had to become educated first and rich first. And I think now we're paying back, and we're paying back more than anyone else I know in the region.
Thank you. Did I see the lady opposite with a question?
Thank you. And I hope I'm not doing a windy intervention like you spoke of earlier. Apologize if I do. I kind of want to go back, and I'm sorry, Vicki Bailey with Anderson Stratton. My background has been in energy regulation and public policy for many years. So this is an interesting discussion for me to participate in as it relates to talent, growing talent, education, and all those areas. And I'm going to take it from the higher ground back to the role of government. And what's impressed me about this discussion is the willingness of the government to actually govern, if you know what I mean. You know, it's easy to call balls and strikes and put the carrots and sticks out there, but the ability to govern is sometimes very difficult to achieve, and I think you're doing that by your willingness to take the lead. And I was listening to the ambassador's remarks, and when you said, yes, we are in a hurry, and I think it's always a good idea to proceed with a sense of urgency, and I detect that in what you're talking about. But my perspective probably comes mainly from the U.S. perspective, from the standpoint of, you know, in my mind, government can give direction. We talked about that nexus of industry and government. And I think government can be a catalyst for innovation. And I think from that standpoint, government's role is not necessarily to pick winners and losers. I think the role is to remove the barriers to entry, make it possible for all those from bottom up, top bottom, to participate and have an opportunity in the economy. So from that standpoint, I guess I was wondering, you know, energy policy in the U.S. has had a very difficult road. I mean, every administration wants to tackle energy policy, and there's always hiccups and starts and challenges there. But from the standpoint of what I'm thinking of, you know, we have issues right now with a crisis of confidence, not only in education with our K through 12. I'm not even at the NYU level yet. I'm down there with the young folks, the elementary K through 12 individuals. We have financial markets and some of our industries. You know, there's just an unreadiness, a paralyzation that's happened, I guess, because of the recession and because of other things. But how do you grow those small businesses? How do you know, you're looking at the non-oil sector of your economy, but my question maybe goes to, you know, how are you able to grow that middle section and get those who maybe are inarticulate?
You put the nub of the question there, so let's pick up on that. Role of government, the limits perhaps of what government should do, and in particular, not the big guys, but how do you encourage that middle size entrepreneurship that might have the possibility of reaching scale, is what I'm hearing. Mohammed, do you want to take a shot at that?
Yes, indeed. Of course, the government here plays the role of facilitator and enabling initiator. And it plays an important role to this particular business. But we export, order for them to gain experience, to have access to the miners with the rigs under cost, and to guide them how to export the services and products to outside and promote their business as well. So in this respect, we have to create an entity called Sheikh Khalifa Fund. The Sheikh Khalifa Fund looked to all the ideas that start on businesses and support from the beginning all the ideas that make success in this journey and help them through providing them with the advice and access to fund if they have good businesses, and also to open the market for them. So in this sense now, we find that small and medium-sized companies start to take the, take the role needed in this country. And plus, we are developing now few number of policies that will enable them to continue taking the role in the economy and participate in the GDP. Of course, we are at the beginning stage actually, and they need a lot of lesson and a lot of care. But this policy actually start to produce some good results and to continue to be that case in the future.
A quick follow-up on this point?
Yeah, just to follow on Mohammed's comments, I think what we discovered with the Khalifa Fund, which was launched around 4 years ago, was that these small, medium-sized business enterprises can not only be a major catalyst economically, but going back to the innovative theme that we have here, these are the types of products, initiatives, or concepts that are born from an idea as opposed to a big commercial concept. So we launched the Khalifa Fund about 3 years ago. It has been incredibly successful. Many of these people who just simply had an idea were given a platform or financial support to launch their idea. Khalifa Fund also provides training, because if you just have an idea, you have a product here that you think you can sell, you're not necessarily well trained or equipped to actually run the business. So the fund also provides training on how to run your business. And I think from both the economic and the innovative factors, the Sheikh Khalifa Fund is going to be one of our most important entities in the UAE.
Very good. Well, that's the last word for the morning panel. I think you'll all agree we had quite a robust start to the day. I think it's very promising, omen for the rest of our sessions to come. We heard certainly about the ambitions, extraordinary ambitions, and some of the thoughtfulness of the leadership. We also heard some challenges and provocations that I know will be continued throughout our afternoon and tomorrow. From my perspective, I would just leave you with these words before we go to a coffee break. It has been argued in looking at how complex systems change, that you need tools, you need rules, and you need to change social norms. And I think we've seen each of those in turn addressed, at least incipiently, by this conversation. I encourage you all to take that up and, in the spirit of the Aspen Institute, continue the robust dialogue going forward. Please join me in giving a warm round of applause.